Good morning and welcome to Trauma and Lactation Lunch and Learn. Please mute your microphones unless you are speaking, and having your camera on is also optional. Please put any questions in the chat or unmute to ask, and then work with your supervisor to sign in and for your CEUs. I'm pleased to welcome Melissa Doyle, Resiliency Strategy Director for the Maine Resilience Building Network. Just a note, Hug Your Baby will be on August 9th, and September 13th, we will have Civil Rights Lunch and Learn. Now a little bit about Melissa. Melissa is a clinical social worker who has worked in the trauma and violence intervention and prevention fields for over 15 years. Prior to joining Merben, she worked directly with trauma survivors, primarily of sexual and domestic violence, in a healthcare setting. She also worked extensively with healthcare providers to enhance their knowledge of trauma-informed practice. Thank you for meeting with us and welcome, Melissa.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ginger and Sam, and so nice to be with you all today. So I am going to get going and share my screen, and I have a feeling I won't be able to see the chat. So Sam, I will see if it's okay if you will share with me. This give me a second to get going. I did practice this, I promise, but it still seems to be funky a little bit every time. So let's see. Now, all right. Can you all can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Sure can.
All right. Well, let's get going then. So thanks again, Ginger, for the introduction. Yeah, I'm Melissa Doyle. So I've practiced with folks who've experienced trauma, as Ginger mentioned, for over 15 years. So this is in a healthcare setting. So really thinking about, I've worked a lot with new parents and folks experiencing violence kind of currently, and folks with historical trauma as well. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them throughout. Like I said, probably can't see the chat, but I think Sam's going to let us know if there are any questions. So feel free to stop me at any point and ask. I think you're all familiar with Merben at this point, and what we do across the state. And again, I'm just happy to be here with you all today. As we always do, I just want to take a moment to just sort of ground ourselves before we dive into our discussion, just to let go of what we're coming from, what we maybe were doing right before this. Even if you're multitasking now, I think it's really nice to be able to just sort of breathe for a second, let it out, and transition into whatever you're doing in the moment, even if it's a couple things at a time. But I'm just going to give us the opportunity to take a few deep breaths and just sort of get comfortable for the next little bit that we have together. If you want to do that, go ahead. All right. And I do just want to also say that we do this as part of our practice when we're giving talks and presentations, but this is also something I think that is really can be really helpful when you're doing your own work. I know that sometimes a lot of folks are coming in maybe a little anxious about what they're going to be doing with you all, or it might be, just entering into a new system might be challenging. And so just pausing and taking ourselves and letting our clients and our patients off autopilot for a minute can be really helpful. So I find this a helpful practice sort of in any setting that I'm in. What we're going to be doing today is just a really brief review of trauma-informed systems. I know Ruby did a fantastic job last week of kind of really going through it in her talk on trauma-informed and stigma. But I just want to ground us today in a little bit of the trauma-informed practice. And then we'll be talking about the scope of trauma, trauma reactions, how they may impact a parent's decision about infant feeding, and then what are some strategies to engage with folks who have experienced trauma. Because everyone's experience with trauma is really different and how it sort of manifests individually, we'll be talking sort of what are some common themes we see, and again, some language that you then can take to personalize it for yourselves. But anytime we talk about trauma, it's a hard topic, I think. It may trigger our own experiences or our own concerns. So I just want to encourage folks to really take care of themselves, do whatever you need to do throughout. If you need to take a break, totally fine. So So we talked about this last week a little bit, why be trauma informed? And it's really, again, the answer hasn't changed. It's that trauma is so widespread. It's a costly public health issue. We can't look at anybody and know if they've been experienced trauma or not. And trauma informed is sort of the umbrella that we're working under. And then a trauma sensitive environment is all of those universal precautions we take. So what do we do? How do we treat everybody? And then there are times that we need sort of trauma specific interventions for certain folks that they've disclosed a history of trauma, or we see certain behaviors that we can be curious about if there was trauma in their history. And then we provide effective care, and then we consider really how our relationships with folks really help heal. So much time of the time trauma happens sort of interpersonally, so in relationship, and so healing can happen in relationship. And so these are some, I think, just some powerful reasons why we focus on it. And if we think about sort of a traditional model, and this is the systems that many of us have experienced or worked in, it's certainly in healthcare. It was really designed as a deficit-based model, that looking at problems with an expert, a provider or the doctor is sort of the one who holds all the knowledge, and not sort of sharing equal footing with the patient necessarily. It can be kind of gatekeeping, a little bit rigid. Asking what's wrong with you, really locating the problem within the individual, and why are you acting that way, so that it becomes a really sort of problem saturated approach. Whereas if we think about a trauma informed approach, it shifts sort of away from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, what experiences have led to these, sort of reactions or behaviors. And then, but we really can lead with strength. We can lead with curiosity, and we understand behaviors or adaptations. It's not, it's not pathology. It allows for sort of a more equal footing in the room. So we might hold, specialized knowledge and expertise, but the client really holds awareness of their own life and their own history. And so it sort of levels the playing field a bit and allows for that mutual collaboration. It kind of voices and choice is sort of encouraged, and there's, again, equality there. And then we have sort of language and a lens awareness of that there's sort of more sort of to this person than just what they're presenting with as a problem. And so it really asks, what are the strengths of this person, right? So we're trying to shift the paradigm away from sort of problem saturated, problem focused on one individual, and sort of what are strengths balanced with challenges. We don't want to get, people are coming often with issues, and we want to get to those, but what's already going well is an important question to be asking too. And so when we're not trauma informed, or systems aren't, or individuals aren't, it can interfere with help seeking behavior. So even the initiation of services can get challenging. And if folks do initiate services, it can lead to early dropout or limited engagement. We can inadvertently re-traumatize people. So just going through systems, sometimes folks will say, it reminded me of a certain situation. It was too much. It was overwhelming. And then there can be a lack of connection to additional resources and services that would help folks sort of down the road as well. So I just want to pause for a second, and folks are welcome to put this in the chat if they want, or just reflect for themselves. When you think of a trauma survivor, what does it look like? And what do you consider trauma? What do we consider in our own minds? And if folks just want to think about it for a second, if anyone wants to put it in the chat, please feel free to. And Sam, if you don't mind sharing, if anything comes up, let me know. All right. So why do I ask us to do that is sort of because we want to start to be a little expansive, I think, in thinking about what trauma is. So oftentimes we think of the individual or the interpersonal traumas that happen, but we also have to be aware of what are the collective traumas that are happening, or generational traumas that are happening around us. And so this is not even the most expansive list. I know this group has updated this chart again, but it speaks, I think, to sort of the range of experiences that people have that may be challenging for them. And what defines trauma is really an event or a series of events that are experienced as physically or emotionally harmful, where the effects are lasting. And I actually think that last bullet is sort of the most important in some ways, because we can all experience a similar event at the same time, but it's going to affect each of us differently, right? Whether because of our history, because of, other experiences we've had in our lives. So the effects, that's why we can't sort of look at someone and say that person, has clearly experienced trauma or not. And so it sort of challenges that we can't make assumptions about what folks have gone through. Trauma can also be acute, so those one-time events. It can be chronic, sort of happening over time, or it can be complex, which is sort of the intersection of trauma or multiple traumas. And that's where a lot of sort of the generational or collective traumas can come in, that when you're existing in an sort of an environment of, say, sexism or racism or xenophobia, and then you have maybe acute or chronic traumas that layer on top of that, that's where some of those complex traumas certainly can happen amongst other places. But my hope is not to sort of memorize this list in any way, but to just understand sort of the expansiveness of trauma, and that we know that sort of 60 to 70% of folks at least have experienced trauma, or we've been affected, or their loved ones have been affected by it. And that speaks to the pervasiveness, I think, of trauma. Whether the effects are, again, lasting and how impactful they are, we don't know. And we don't necessarily need to know what the trauma was in order to sort of work with folks and understand how we can best support them going forward. So I'm going to talk just for a minute about the brain, because I think it will become important when we think about sort of trauma reactions later on. But there are sort of three things I want to talk about when we talk about stress reactions and trauma reactions in the brain. And that's the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the prefrontal. And I'm going to stay away from the hippocampus, other than to say that that's really where our memories are stored. And so when somebody is triggered, it's sort of pulling from the hippocampus, or that gets stimulated to produce a memory. But the prefrontal and the amygdala are sort of the parts of our brain that are involved in a lot of our day-to-day sort of activities. And I'm going to use the hand model of the brain. So the amygdala is what would be my thumb, and then my fingers on top are the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal is where we do a lot of our most evolved thinking. It's where our logic comes from. It's our ability to plan and execute, and sort of our thinking, our really good thinking, our learning. When the prefrontal is online, we're really sort of our best selves. And this is where we sort of want to be optimally going throughout our day-to-day. When we experience a stress reaction, which is sort of that alarm bell going off that something is wrong, we do something called flipping our lid, where the prefrontal goes offline. It's not in the driver's seat anymore, and the amygdala is really in the driver's seat, and that turns on our fight, flight, or freeze response, and then the host and the cascade of physiological reactions that come after that. So our pupils dilate, our blood flow increases, our mouths dry out. So that all happens when our stress response is sort of turned on by a real or perceived threat. And when that's sort of in the driver's seat, our brain is not in its thinking, learning, sort of planning place. And so we need to re-regulate the brain in order to get back to that place. But the amygdala is really like our fire alarm. And so it's telling us that I need to protect the brain and the body, and that's all I'm going to do. And it's adaptive. That's a good thing. We want that. If we see a bear in the room or in the woods, certainly in the room, but in the woods, we want to be able to just react, and we want to run, and that's it. And so it's a very adaptive part of our brain. The issue comes when this part of the amygdala is sort of triggered more often than it needs to be, because folks aren't actually under threat, but they may feel under threat. And so a lot of folks with trauma histories, the amygdala is really easy to activate. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, but just sort of thinking about how our brains sort of are primed to pay attention to the negative, and threats can become really important for folks. All right. So some early effects, or some effects of trauma too, besides thinking about the brain, Our relationship to others, our attachment, which I know I'm guessing you folks talk about all the time, understanding who is safe, what's safe, and what isn't. Can I trust and be vulnerable? These early attachment disruptions can really lead to challenges in navigating systems, navigating safe relationships. And if we think about it, it makes a lot of sense that when especially if it's maybe been a caregiver who has been sort of the perpetrator of trauma, that person sort of is supposed to keep us safe. They don't keep us safe. And so we get a really disrupted sense of attachment, or can lead to challenges. And so this is when we might see some risky behaviors or some inability to understand who is safe and who isn't. And even though we may see ourselves as really safe folks, clients may not always understand. Is it safe to run towards this person or away? Is it safe to trust and be vulnerable because they may have been hurt by that vulnerability before? So the relationship to others, that attachment, can really get disrupted with folks who've experienced especially early childhood trauma. The relationship to the body might also be disrupted. Understanding too, if the body is a safe place, can it keep them safe? Can it be trusted to do what it's supposed to do? Is it safe to even feel? And so especially if those who have experienced some body violations, such as sexual abuse or assault, or if their body isn't performing in a fashion, maybe due to medical trauma, there can be a lot of anxiety around, is it safe to sort of rely on my body to do what it's supposed to do? And if we think about a new parent trying to make a decision about feeding, trying to, to have a relationship that involves a lot of touch, this can be a really tricky area for them. So, trying to understand what somebody's relationship to their body is can be an important window into sort of how can we support them going forward. But a lot of folks, especially again, those who've experienced some sort of body violation, have a really complicated relationship to their body and to sort of touch in general. And then finally, their relationship to self. There might be a lot of judgment or fear of judgment. I talk a lot about with folks like good enoughness. Do they have a sense of what's good enough? And they might also have a fear of failure or of letting you down. And again, this makes a lot of sense. Some people have really gotten explicit messages or implicit messages that they aren't good enough, that no one's going to believe them, or that they're going to be judged for sharing their experiences or stories. And so those are narratives that are really powerful and kind of running through folks' minds. And again, sort of setting up a relationship can be really tricky if they're not feeling sort of secure in who they are, or that anyone will want to help them. And so these sort of the relationship to the self can be, again, and if we think about new parents in general, a lot of doubts are coming up, I'm sure. And so then you layer in trauma on top of that, where there's already perhaps a rocky sort of relationship to self. It can be a pretty tricky experience. So those are some ways that sort of trauma can kind of disrupt certain developmental processes. And then we think, okay, so how does it present when folks are sitting in your office, or when you're meeting with them? And this, again, is not an exhaustive list, but this is just thinking about trauma presents in different ways for different people. And you don't need to, memorize this. You don't need to know all of these, but just to understand, again, there's a range of ways that trauma can manifest for folks. So we can see cognitive impact, confusing, again, what's safe and what's dangerous, trouble focusing or concentrating, difficulty imagining the future, which can be, again, really tricky if you've got a little one that you're holding and you're trying to, build a bond and then kind of picture what is it going to look like down the road. Folks who have trauma experiences may find that really challenging for themselves in general. And then you sort of, again, layer in a newborn or a baby on top of that, and that can be pretty triggering for some folks. I spoke already to sort of the loss of trust or sense of self. And then we might see what you would probably more typically, have heard about: hypervigilance, flashbacks, intrusive thoughts. And I'm going to get to in a little bit why that's particularly maybe tricky for when we think about lactation and breast or chest feeding in general. Emotionally, it might show up for folks. So again, some pretty typical ones in nightmares, sleep disturbances, talked about difficulty trusting others, helplessness, or feeling easily overwhelmed. Again, that's a kind of new parent thing in general. But if somebody's already that way at baseline, and then you add in another kind of stressful situation, that can become more acute and pronounced. You can see a increase in anger or irritability, and then other folks are going to kind of chronically numb or feel empty. And so again, a wide range, which means you don't have to know all of it, other than we can start to ask the question for folks, how does it show up for you? And then let's work with that. Behaviorally, might see some of these things. Talked again about risky behaviors, maybe protective behaviors, reverting to younger behaviors, withdrawal or isolation. And then there are kind of a host of ways that it shows up physically too. And so unexplained physical or medical issues. There's no underlying cause for something, but folks might experience aches and pains, or might recoil to touch, low energy, things like that. And those can all be trauma reactions. So again, this is just sort of to highlight that there's a range of ways trauma can show up, and it's going to sort of be different for everybody. When it comes to breastfeeding or chest feeding itself, in particular, the stress response system and the oxytocin systems are sort of, there are two systems that don't work together. If the oxytocin system is sort of the pleasure system. And so when we're feeling good, the stress system is off. When we're stressed, the pleasure system is off, and they're pretty mutually exclusive. And so when that stress system is turned on, when the stress system is turned off and our sort of pleasure system is turned on, oxytocin is produced, which helps with milk ejection, sort of that letdown response. And so when our brains are stressed, though, that isn't turned on, which makes it obviously really challenging. And the way I've described it to people is, imagine sitting in a room, trying to breastfeed or chest feed, and there's a tiger sitting right next to you, right? And not like a nice cuddly one, but one that's growling and baring its teeth and fangs. Your body is just going to naturally react to that stress, and the stress system will kick on, and it's going to be really hard to sort of engage with what you're trying to do and, initiate the breastfeeding or chest feeding process. So that's one way that, again, trauma really can impact really directly that process of feeding. Disconnection from the body is another way for a lot of survivors it shows up. And this, again, was an adaptive response for many. So especially those who experience early childhood trauma. Disconnection from the body, that sort of idea of looking at the body, maybe while something was happening to it. So having some distance was a really protective way to handle maybe abuse, especially early childhood abuse. And so folks have sort of continued that maybe as a coping mechanism into adulthood. But again, you can imagine that if you're trying to feed a baby, that's going to be a really difficult way to engage with the baby, if you're sort of feeling disconnected and dissociated from your body. The idea of physical touch for many, whether it's self-touch, so kind of that self-manipulation of trying to, get a breast in the mouth, or infant touch, or provider touch. These can also be sort of really triggering for folks, especially if it's not expected, right? So if a provider is coming around to sort of help, or to even put their hand on your shoulder, that can cause a real physical sort of trigger or reaction, which, if remember when we talked about the brain, it's sort of making your prefrontal kind of go offline, and you're in a stress response when that happens. So even though if you've got a baby in front of you, that baby's not intending to do you any harm, but your brain doesn't know that. And so if you are particularly sensitive to touch, your brain is just going to go into that stress response place, and it's going to be really challenging, to sort of initiate some of that breastfeeding. And so to understand that maybe physical touch is really challenging, then we can work to reduce sort of what are the stimuli that are affecting folks. So lack of a support system might not be sort of as intuitive, but I'm sure you all talk about and think about, that people are more successful in initiating breastfeeding and probably sticking with it, or chest feeding, if they've got a support system that talks about it, maybe acknowledges it, sees it as a viable path forward for folks. And so if a lot of those who've experienced trauma, again, especially early childhood trauma, don't have a support system, don't have folks who are around to sort of try ideas out on or discuss things like this. And so that's going to sort of impact their ability and their confidence in doing things. And even those, I know folks without trauma histories who experience this as well, but we know that, again, there might be those implicit or explicit messages that you don't deserve this, you fail at everything. And so that not only sort of a lack of support, but some real targeted sort of messaging that somebody isn't able to do something can be, again, another sort of real impediment to either initiating or sustaining with feeding. And then complex trauma. So we know about 45% of women or those who give birth experience birth trauma. And so if you've already got pre-existing trauma underneath that intersection of those traumas are going to perhaps be sort of, again, triggering to what comes next. So again, with any sort of feeding, if you've got those complex traumas, it can be really tricky to kind of navigate what the waters that come after that. Even if folks felt pretty secure in how that they are coping and that they were managing before birth, after birth, if they did experience birth trauma, that can be a real tricky time. So these are just some of the sort of, and then there's one more, the unpredictable nature of when a baby needs to feed. And so this is something that the literature really supports. At night, it's particularly hard. And we know, I think, again, sort of a lot of new parents are saying, we know being woken up in the middle of the night to have to feed is challenging. But you add, again, that layer of trauma in there, and perhaps someone who didn't have a lot of control or doesn't have a lot of control over their schedule, or maybe they were woken up in the middle of the night as part of their trauma. This can be sort of a huge barrier for folks. So sort of that there's a lack of predictability. And we know with trauma that sort of that's been taken away with them by definition almost. Agency has been removed from them. And so what we do a lot, and when we're supporting trauma survivors, is try to give them some agency back. But babies don't sort of live by that, predictability. And so the unpredictable nature of when somebody needs something from you can, again, be a really triggering experience for folks. Before I go on, are there any questions that I can answer about sort of how trauma may impact feeding or just folks in general before we sort of think about what do we do about it?
There is nothing in the chat as of right now, but feel free to unmute yourselves.
And I'll leave time at the end too. So lots of different ways, again, that trauma might show up for folks, that it impacts feeding in general or specifically. So then the question is, what do we do about it? How do we sort of start to address it? And I think this is one of the number one sort of tools in our toolbox, is to lead with curiosity versus sort of making assumptions. Again, we don't know, and we will probably never know sort of the entire history of somebody, and we really don't need to know. What we can be curious about, though, is just how it impacts them and what do they need moving forward. And so it allows us to bring intention into our space, and that we can understand that attitudes and behaviors are someone's sort of best attempt to dealing, with what they've got in front of them right now. So how do we use curiosity? It's just, first of all, I think that bringing that lens to something instead of assuming that someone's trying to be difficult, and Ruby talked last week about in talking about stigma, that instead of someone being manipulative, we can understand that someone's trying to get their needs met and be curious about why it's happening that way, maybe. But it sort of externalizes, again, and takes away the individuals doing something wrong, and really helps us understand there's probably been some situations that have impacted that person's ability to sort of move through systems in a certain way or move through experiences. So thinking about engagement, one thing is we can go slowly and build authentic connection and try to enjoy it even. And I know everyone's pressed for time, and that can be a barrier for folks. But I think if we can build a strong foundation, then that sort of pays dividends in the end. So this is a pretty obvious one, is when we can build an authentic connection that allows for folks to share their strengths as well as their challenges. And that leads to the next one, that we can promote wholeness, that the client is more than the presenting issue. So more than just sort of what they're coming in for, or what they're reporting, or what they're saying the challenges are. And I'll give some specific language in a minute in the next slide about how to maybe ask some of those questions. We can understand that the next best choice will look different for different people, and then different than what we may want. So we might see all the reasons for somebody to do things a certain way. And then they choose something different, and that might frustrate us. And I saw this a lot with providers when I was working around a lot of domestic violence, and folks really wanted someone to go get a restraining order, and they couldn't understand why someone didn't want to get a restraining order. But if we sat and sort of really looked at all of the reasons, there were often really good reasons that the client was saying that's not the best choice for me, whether they'd had their own experience with the police in the past, or they were worried about being sort of there was racial bias or something, or that the police hadn't protected them before, right? And so when we brought those experiences into the room, then we can make the shift that the next best choice, although we really wanted someone to have that tool in their toolbox of a restraining order, really wasn't a good choice for them. But that can be frustrating sometimes, and so we have to, can acknowledge that. But I always think about it that it's the next best choice in the moment. We're making the best choice we can, given the information that we have at the time. We can identify strengths, which I already talked about. What are clients already doing successfully? What are they doing well? And we can even lead with that. We can use inclusive language. So I know folks talk about chest feeding or body feeding as well. And that's not just to be sort of politically correct, but also it can de-gender a situation. So if folks have experienced sort of an abuse or neglect or trauma that involved sort of their gender, by externalizing a little bit, using sort of non-triggering language for folks, it's a lot more accessible to sort of hear the ideas. So if folks don't feel connected to breastfeeding, for instance, using chest feeding can be a way to sort of desensitize the environment, so that it's a term that feels more sort of something that they can grab onto a little bit more easily versus the gendered language. I think it also helps with the being inclusive for folks who, as we know, experience, sort of identify in a range of ways. And so we can be inclusive to those folks as well. But even for folks who might identify as female or cisgender, but don't feel, again, they feel disembodied or disconnected from their bodies, externalizing and using sort of inclusive language can help just desensitize the environment a little bit. And then the biggest takeaway, I think, is just to ask before touching or doing. And we all, I think, get caught up, in sort of wanting to help and to wanting to really support, a client, but asking permission before moving forward, again, trying to give agency back, is a really important way for somebody to sort of be a partner in the process versus it being in that expert mode a little bit. And remember, when our brains are offline, when our amygdala is driving the bus, we're not in a learning place. Our brains aren't in a learning place. It's in that triggered sort of a fire alarm going off place. And so folks aren't learning anyway. So if they've been triggered by touch, or a lot of folks report that someone standing behind them without narrating what they're doing is a really triggering experience, then we can and so they're sort of just focused on safety, and they're not hearing what you have to say anyway. So really, the asking before touching or doing, and then narrating what you might be doing, it can be a really sort of powerful way to engage folks. So I want to talk about options for language, and just to say, you'll need to work this into your own sort of language. So I think to make it natural and authentic. So I've got a couple of options for sort of, instead of saying this, let's try this, and then some trauma inquiry. How do we sort of ask the question about what people's experiences are? So I'll just go through them kind of quickly. So thinking about jumping in and starting, instead of saying like, let's get started, or, why are you here today? To try, like, how are things going? Leaving an open-ended question, or what's new and good so far? And to make a shift maybe from what's some sort of the problem saturated what's going wrong to what's new and good, and allowing somebody to lead with strengths, that can be an alternative to that deficit model, and really sort of trying to help folks see that they have strengths and to bring those into the room, into the relationship. It's a lens shift too. Again, our brains are primed to see sort of the negative and what's gone wrong. And so kind of pushing folks into and if you think about it, your own answer to the question, how are you, is usually, for all of us, either good, which doesn't give a lot of information, or I'm so exhausted, or I'm so stressed. We focus on the negative a lot of the time, which is adaptive. Again, you only get one shot. Sometimes if you were going to eat a bad berry back in the caveman days, you only had one shot to get it right. And so our brains are really primed to see what is dangerous and what's wrong. But if we can help shift the paradigm a little bit to what's new, what's good, what's going well, then we can look for those strengths. If somebody reports something and we say something like, a lot of people say that, I would just sort of try, I hear that you've been trying a lot of different things. This can be a challenge for a lot of new parents. So validating the experience of the individual while also normalizing to sort of the collective experience can be a powerful thing for folks, that I hear you and I hear that you are struggling with this, and this is a common challenge. So sort of encompassing both the validation and the normalizing. If you're trying to get some inquiry around, do you plan to breast or chest feed? You could just simply ask the question a little bit more expansively. What have you heard about breast, chest, or body feeding? For folks that, living in groups that don't ever talk about it, that will give you some information. Or what have you heard about feeding options, even just to get a little bit more information, and it externalizes the experience to make it kind of easier to discuss. Folks won't feel judged. They won't hear judgment in that as much. And so that's sort of what we're trying to avoid, even though if that's not our intention, folks can sometimes hear do you plan to do this as sort of a judgment, even when we don't intend it to be. So just asking sort of a little bit more expansively, what have you heard about it? And what have you heard about your options? If you suspect, or it feels important to understand a little bit more about that if there have been experiences that have led to certain behaviors, we don't ever need to know, and Ruby said last week, disclosure is never sort of the goal. But if we can understand if there are experiences that people have had that would be helpful to know about, and then any preferences moving forward, that's where trauma inquiry can become important. So are there any life experiences that would be helpful for me to know about? Doesn't require disclosure necessarily. It can just be sort of, what do you think is important? And then how does that impact show up? And I often say too, like, headlines, not details. I just, if there are any things that you want to share, feel free, but I don't need to know the details, and in fact, if you're not in a setting or you don't have the time to really support people, I would really discourage the sharing of details anyway, if people start to share. But we just want, but it really speaks to impact. That's what we're after. Is there an impact that we can be supportive around, not what happened? And then, do you have any preferences you'd like to share with me that would make you feel more comfortable? It allows for collaboration and reduces sort of the power differential that you hold all the knowledge and they don't hold any. And so that collaboration, that mutuality can sort of be more explicit. So those are just some options, again, to sort of ask the open-ended questions. I think that building of rapport is sort of demonstrating that this is sort of a safe place to discuss things, but that they don't have to share anything more than what they're comfortable with. Just go through these kind of quickly. Like we did at the beginning of our session, sort of grounding somebody at the beginning of the visit. Okay, to just take a moment to land before we dive in. We're also programmed, again, to be on autopilot and just to sort of move forward. But for both ourselves and the customer, the client, to just really take a moment to land. Being transparent, there's some language here similar to what I just shared, and then offer a shared agenda making, anything that you want to make sure we cover today, or what are your hopes for today's visit. And this isn't a place for folks to list, 20 things, but you could say, what are your top one or two things you're hoping for in today's visit. And it allows you to make sure you're sort of on the same page, right? That you're there for the same reasons and you have the shared understanding. During the visit, you can ensure safety. So if you're working with somebody, asking if they want the door open or closed is one of the number one things that I hear. And we might have our own feelings about it again, like, of course I'd want it open, or of course I'd want it closed. But a lot of folks for different reasons want one or the other. That closed doors can make people feel trapped, and that there's nobody else there that could help them if they need help. Open doors can feel exposing for some. So asking that question, anything that would help you feel more comfortable, especially if you're trying to sort of engage somebody in like direct support around feeding. Normalizing and validating and supporting strengths. Just again, that you hear this person and that we can normalize that a lot of folks may be having challenges with this. Again, validating that you've been trying something. Collaboration, and then checking in throughout. Are you okay? Do we need to take a break? So again, folks often report that they feel like there's just a lot of information coming at them. And if they've been sort of, if they're feeling anxious or they're feeling numb, some sort of reaction, breaks and pauses to build into that a little bit, just again, to make sure that you're sort of keeping up with their pace. That's can be super grounding for folks. And then ending the visit, just checking for understanding. We went over a lot of things today. Can we make sure we're both on the same page? We talked about a lot. Do you want to share back what your understanding is? A lot of times we don't leave time for that. And I get it. Our visits are short often, and we've got a lot to pack in. But this, again, can help people, walk away feeling like I was heard, I was seen. And if we think about giving agency back, this can be really important. Can always offer connections and resources, as long as folks, and if you're sharing any information, as long as they give you permission to share, that's important. Okay. Before I go on, any questions or thoughts that folks want to share? Anything that you do, or actually, why don't you, if you hold that, we can come back to that. But I'd love to hear what folks do already. And so think about it for a minute, and then I'll have you put it in the chat in a second and take my screen share off so that I can see and we can talk a little bit. But I do just want to end with sort of attending to ourselves. We often, I know in this field, hear a lot of stories. We hear a lot of challenges. And so it's important to sort of attend to ourselves in this so that we can provide the best care possible. So there are intervention strategies, I think that we've probably gone over before, but really, taking a breath, taking a moment at times throughout our day so that we don't have a buildup of sort of exposure ourselves to challenges and situations. So if we can build in, every time between clients, we just take 5 deep breaths, or every time we get up to wash our hands, we take a couple of deep breaths. Those regular practices that we can build in throughout the day can really help support sort of that long-term sustainability for ourselves. If we feel something, noticing where we feel it in our body and then naming it. So I've got like a tightness in my chest and I'm feeling stressed. That can sometimes just diffuse some of the power of it. And these are things you could teach to clients as well. If you notice somebody getting really anxious and with maybe if you're trying to teach something about feeding and you notice a reaction, just slowing it down a little bit, helping people name what emotion might be coming up. Finding some sort of anchor, whether it's breath or music or physical grounding, feet on the floor type of thing, so that you can return to that throughout your day. And I know I'm going through these quickly. And supportive gestures is just, are there things that you already do sort of to support yourself? So a lot of times, with stress, we can find ourselves rubbing the backs of our necks, maybe rubbing our hands together. Those are actually physiologically supporting our bodies and our response to our own stress. And so just taking a moment to acknowledge that we also need to slow down and have a little bit of opportunity to sort of build in breaks and getting off autopilot again ourselves throughout the day. And then just again, responding to our own impact, that our brain responds to short doses. So a 90-second walk and then 90 seconds of breathing can make a huge difference in somebody's day. Evidence shows us, or research shows us, that using informal and formal supports can be really important if we, again, are feeling overwhelmed by somebody and somebody's story. Connecting to a group of people who are regulated. And so formal and informal supports. Do you have a supervisor you can go to, but do you also have colleagues that you can share, just pull aside for a few minutes? If you're feeling stressed or overwhelmed, you can connect with a group of people who are feeling more regulated, and that will help sort of bring your own stress level down. Creating rituals for the end of the workday, and then just having compassion and grace for yourself, that this is really hard work that you're doing, also really hopeful and wonderful work, but there are harder days than others, and just acknowledging that, and just being aware of how it's showing up for ourselves is super important. And again, you can teach some of these to folks too, if that's helpful. So that's kind of it for what I have. And I think what I'll do is stop sharing. And then I would love for folks to share themselves. What are you already doing? What are you doing well, that sort of to have some of those engagement opportunities with people? If you know of somebody who has had a trauma history, what has worked well? Anything that anyone wants to share? Yeah. Okay. So I see some earlier things. What do people do well? Because I know you're a talented bunch of people. So what are you doing well? What is already working? Listening. So just taking the time, maybe again, to slow down, but to really listen and do some active listening, I'm guessing too. So that, or reflective listening. So acknowledging, I hear you saying this. Yep. That's great. Anything else? What are you already doing? Or what have you noticed that has worked well with a new parent who's sort of maybe had some challenges that you know of? And you're welcome to unmute too, if you want to speak instead of type, that's fine. Compassion. Yep. And then thanking them. I think that's a huge piece. So thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for trusting me with your story. That goes a long way. And as does compassion. I think so many, again, survivors report they sort of don't ever have, to Nicole's point, don't ever have anyone who really listens to them. And so just that act of caring, and this is where relationships can be healing, right? Relationships may have been hurtful at some point, but they can also be healing. Being gentle, ask them if they are willing to share their hopes for their journey. Remind them that they have access and deserve hope and help. So I love that. And Tamara, that you're holding the hope for them maybe when they can't always. I think again goes a really long way. Before you start, do you have any questions or concerns? Yep. So you're building that shared agenda with them, Jill, which is really, I think, a really great practice. Asking if they're open to receiving information, open to discussing a topic further. Ashley, I think that's also really powerful, is sort of you're putting yourself, you're letting them drive a little bit. You're saying, are they open to hearing it? So sort of equalizing the playing field. Yep. And Jill, going back to asking questions before you start, again, I think that contributes to that, your voices are both important in the room. Yeah, those all make sense. And if some folks really benefit from education and want that sort of psychoed piece around, how does your stress system impact your, capacity or ability to feed? Other folks, that's not interesting to them. So asking how they receive information too, or what is most helpful to them can be important. These are all great thoughts.
Yeah.
Hi.
I just wanted to kind of just saying about the perspective. and to start and when Biden time during the session that it sort of leaves people uneasy. So I've found that to be kind of a best practice for me, in addition to asking what they're hoping to get out of the appointment, but sort of giving a play-by-play of what is coming next.
Melissa, I muted you so that the feedback stopped. So you're gonna, I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. Thank you. No, that was perfect, Sam. Thanks. So Tasha, did I hear you say, yeah, that you give them sort of what the visit will probably look like, or sort of the arc of the visit? Is that what I heard you say? Okay, that's perfect. Yeah, that's super, I think, again, super powerful and important if we think about the reason agency has been taken away, and that you're sort of trying to give them an expectation of what comes next. So predictability is really key, I think, is what you're speaking to. And again, challenge for when you've got somebody who's trying to, come in or that can be a challenge to breastfeeding or chest feeding in general, is that unpredictability. And so wherever you can, how do you build it back in? No, it wasn't your fault at all. I needed to mute. And yeah, in addition to asking what they hope to get out of their time. Yep. I think, again, those are really some powerful ways. And I think I knew there was a lot of knowledge in the room and a lot of experience. So yeah, all of these I think are great and empowering ways. And I hear inherent in this too is just building in the strengths-based perspective, right? That they have things that they're doing well, even though there might be some risk factors in there, or might be challenges still, and we can't ignore them. But to really build on what is going well and what are someone's strengths, and if somebody can answer some of these questions and share what their hopes and fears are, then you've got a lot more information to work with for the individual. Anything else that folks want to share? Any questions or thoughts? All right. Anything, Sam, that you're seeing?
Nope, I don't see any chats or hands raised or anything. So if anybody does come up with any questions and you would like me to relay them to Melissa, or Melissa, I can give them your email address if that's okay. Then we can get any questions or anything answered that way.
Yeah.
But otherwise,
chat too. So if folks want to reach out directly, or if they have a specific situation that they want to talk about, I'm happy to think through it again as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Melissa. And if there are no other questions, we'll give you guys a couple of minutes back before your next appointment or meeting or wherever you're off to. Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah, sure. Thank you all. I really appreciated the time with you today. And thank you, Sam, too, for facilitating everything as well.